Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Nick Greyno. Nick is a strength coach over at the University of Maryland and works with the women's lacrosse and field hockey teams. Nick and I are going to be discussing a lot of important considerations, whether you're a PT, strength coach, athlete, whatever that way. We're talking about how to kind of walk the walk in this space. So how to actually mean what you say, do what you say, make your actions match your words, and so on that way. So the kind of things that are often overlooked, but ultimately move the needle forward to a greater capacity than some of the other things. So great episode. I know you're going to take a lot from it. I know I certainly did. Before we get to it, though, make sure you check out Season 5 sponsor ISOFIT. They're my go-to for all things isometric strength training. You can check that out in the description below. Enjoy. Nick, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you having me on.
For people who might not be familiar with you, or maybe they haven't kept up to date with all the amazing stuff you're doing over there in Maryland, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm currently an athletic performance coach here at the University of Maryland. So I have all of strength and conditioning responsibilities for women's lacrosse and women's field hockey here at the university. So just to go in depth a little bit of like what I might do on a day-to-day, that's everything from weight room type of stuff, on-field warm-ups, taking over certain GPS and sports science responsibilities within the two sports. So a lot of GPS tracking. So that's everything from, monitoring player distance, player loads within practices and games, high speed distance, accelerations, decelerations, things like that. So anything that you could think of that is involved on field in sport, we're constantly monitoring and tracking all of those types of metrics and things like that to make sure that at the end of the day, our approach and process to training, the product that we are working towards team wide is, very calculated, and we're taking a very scientific based approach to all of our stuff and what we're doing within practices in the weight room and things like that to make sure that, in hopes to put the best product on the field as possible.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And that's a new emerging area of, sports science, for lack of a better way to put it. And it takes a lot to really wrap your head around a lot of those things. There's a lot of learning involved. And it's something that doesn't necessarily come easy to everyone. And I think that's one of the many things I've come to admire about you, Nick, is it seems like you are someone who has a unmatched work ethic, whether it's like up at 3 or 4 in the morning or up at 10 o'clock at night. Like, I feel like the whole concept of 8 hours of sleep can't exist for you at this point.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, yeah, not quite. There's days where I at this point, I did get 8 hours last night since we're on a more of a spring break type of schedule. I probably run more closer to the 6, 7 again. I really try and prioritize my time the best I can to make sure that, I'm still able to, come to work and be the best version of myself professionally and personally. I am somebody who is extremely passionate about this field and take a lot of responsibility and things on, and just always make sure I, have a growth mindset to things. I'm always trying to figure out new ways to do stuff. From a training perspective, I don't think I know it all. I'm trying to, I take every single day as a learning opportunity, and I'm always trying to find new ways and better ways to approach training, just to make sure that, at the end of the day, I'm doing what's best for, my coaches and athletes, at this university. I think I owe it to them, and due to, even taking on this job, for example, the opportunity to come work with two, future Hall of Fame coaches, in their respective sports, in my opinion, two of the best, that have ever done it. The opportunity to come in to even learn under them and, to take what they already have as historic programs and to take them to the next level. I'm honored to be here in this position to work under them and with these athletes who choose to come here to this university. So I take a lot of pride in my approach and my day-to-day and just how I approach everything, within my profession.
And I think that's the kind of mindset that leads you to succeed in this type of field, right? Like if you kind of sit there and you say, you know what, I'm going to sit on my hands. I know what I need to know. I'm just going to go through the motions, hey, I'm a strength coach, so the kids are going to do their workouts, but I don't really need to do it myself. Like you're not going to get very far. At the end of the day, you're in the field and business of working with people, and, people can smell bullcrap a mile away in today's day and age. And I feel
Mm,
like if you aren't putting forth the effort and energy and investing the passion yourself, then the people you work with are not going to reciprocate that at all. And you're not going to get the outcomes that you're looking for. And again, I think that's something that is essential, but often overlooked in today's day and age. Is it seems like there's a lot of people who, know what to do and they'll gladly tell someone else what to do, but they struggle to follow their own advice, for lack of a better way to put it. Or, they know that exercise and tracking metrics and physiological data and recovery is important, and yet they don't bother doing it themselves.
mm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And that's something like for me professionally and personally, even like it's important, I think, within, what you're trying to give your athletes, what your goals are for yourself. I think it's important to have like a why behind like everything that you do, with going on to that. And I think like touching on like practicing what you preach and things like that, I see a lot. I think of people that do stuff, whether it's, for themselves or even with their athletes that, looks cool on social media, and people start to do kind of random stuff that you see with their athletes. And I think it's like, in my opinion, like it's a disservice to them and like their overall development. I think it's important to constantly strive to be an expert within your field and to have a why behind everything that you do, because, athletes might not even have a clue about, what you're even saying, what you're trying to get them to do. And you might not have any clue about what you're talking about in some of those situations. And, if you can't demonstrate even the things that you're trying to get them to do, or talk them through, what they might should feel within a certain exercise, or really have any rhyme or reason for what you're doing, like at the end of the day, it like doesn't even really make any sense. You're not going to get what you're trying to do out of it. And, I sometimes think it's kind of a joke when you do see some stuff like that, because it's like, oh, this is what this guy at this university is doing. These are the results he's seeing. Let me just throw that into my next workout. You might have an athlete who is nowhere near the level they need to be at to even perform those types of things. And then if they do have questions or hesitations or don't feel confident or comfortable in those situations, and they're, asking you all of these things, now you're in a position to where now they know you don't even know what you're talking about, because you're just like doing stuff to do stuff. And at the end of the day, like you're trying to build buy-in and trust and stuff with these athletes. So when you do start doing stuff like that, I think it just kind of lessens your ability to be effective and, get the most out of them in those situations.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. We just had this discussion, or a similar discussion, recently on the podcast with Ella Caggiano. We were talking about it more in relation to the online training world, but same thing in the sports performance world, right? Like you get some people out there who just kind of create like random hodgepodge programs where it's like, well, I like that from Instagram. I like this guy, what he's doing. And it creates a system that probably changes every 2 to 3 weeks, because there's
Mm,
always something new on Instagram, and doesn't really get the results that people are after because they're not consistent with anything, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you
yeah,
might go from super high force with like high height depth jumps one week, and the next week you're like maxing their squat because like that's what you saw on Instagram. And ultimately, to your point, it's not providing the best for the people in front of you. And this is very much a service-based industry. And I think that it's so easy to get caught up in some of that eye candy that we see online, but we really have to trust the process and stay the course that comes with programming. And that's been
mm,
something, I even struggle with to a certain point, right? Like it's so fun to just kind of have your little days where you go off program and you hit a couple maxes in the gym because you
yeah,
can.
yeah.
But at the same time, it's like that's probably not going to lead to the best performance long term. So how do you go about say for yourself here, you mentioned about finding your why. I mean, how did you find your why in this space, and how do you turn around and help the athletes that you serve on a day-to-day? How you help them find their why for what they do and why they're doing it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So with this, like, I'll go into like a little bit more about like my background and backstory, like kind of as an athlete and just like as a person. I did pretty much every sport growing up. I ended up doing track and field in college at the Division I and Division II level. So like as an athlete and even going into like some professional background, like I've moved all across the country during my time post college. I've been at, started at UNC Wilmington athlete, finished up at the University of Mount Olive, went to the University of South Carolina, moved to Vail, Colorado, worked with US Ski and Snowboard, through Ski and Snowboard Club Vail out there. Realized I really had a love and passion for collegiate athletics, left the full-time job for an unpaid internship back at Clemson University. From there, went to Maryland, University of West Florida, Florida International, and then TCU right before I took this job at the University of Maryland in June. So I have, in my opinion, like an extremely diverse background where I've worked pretty much with every sport and every age group. And I think also to your point, and we're kind of talking about, having a purpose for everything. I think, people can see that and it looks really cool from the outside. And it's like, oh, look at all these different schools like he's been at, which is awesome. But at the same time, what people don't realize, it's like, okay, well, I've also left 2 full-time jobs for unpaid internships or opportunities to, in hopes, take a step back to in the future, take a step forward. One of my mentors early on, talked about long money versus short money. And it's like, it might look good at the time that you're getting a paycheck and it's like super hard. And it might be a struggle to, leave a full-time, full benefited job to go, potentially live out of a car and not get paid at a university. But it's like, oh, look at his next step. That's so sick. He's now at TCU. And it's like, you don't really realize all the other underlying stuff kind of within it, like working thousands and thousands of unpaid hours and doing all that. So, my goal has always been, and this is something like I take into my day-to-day, just how I approach everything is, making sure I'm trying to set myself up to be the best person and professional I can be. And that's why I think I've been able to kind of take some of these steps, because I know, in 10, 15 years, what my goals are and the vision I kind of have for myself. And like diving into a backstory, like a little bit more, I think time is extremely limited and it's important for you to do something that you love and are passionate about, and it's fragile and can be taken away at any moment. And for example, like as an athlete in college, early on in my college career, my mom, for example, got diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer when I was in college. So just through that time, it made me really realize that, the time you do have is extremely limited, and it's important for you to, pursue something that you are passionate about, even through struggle. And unfortunately, like a few years ago, like we lost her to cancer. And I think it really allows you to put things into perspective a little bit, because like she was always my biggest fan, like throughout my time. A lot of people told me that, I probably shouldn't be having this career path and chasing these, and, you have all these degrees and certifications and you should be getting paid for your work and not doing all this unpaid stuff. But she was always somebody, that was in my corner the entire time. And, after I did it for the second time and left another full-time job to once I got a call from Coach Kaz at TCU, and he was like, yo, come down to Fort Worth, Texas. Like, we'd love to have you down here. So I left down there and, went to learn under somebody who I think is one of the best in the entire industry. So, I mean, through that process, I think for me, it's made it a little bit easier in a way through something that is extremely difficult, just because, I know she would have supported me and wanted me to chase something that, you know, I truly do love and am passionate about. And I think, you know, just through that, finding strength through that and continuing to pursue like what I do love. And that's something that, you know, my goal is to impact, you know, lives daily in a positive manner. And I feel like through what I do, like I'm really able to do that. And it's something that like I just, you know, am crazy passionate about. So I think it goes back to, you know, having a purpose behind everything that you do. You know, nothing is really random that I do. Everything is extremely thought through, even though, you know, I might take obviously certain situations and, you know, risk everything I do have to kind of chase my ultimate goal. But, you know, that's something that I'm striving to do every day. And that's a reason why I do show up every day and, you know, probably work twice as long as I probably should. But it is because, you know, my goal is to do everything I possibly can, like for the young men and women I do work for and my bosses, and to make sure that I'm doing everything possible, you know, ultimately for their success, like in sport. But it's also much bigger than sport, you know, because you're, you know, coaching and helping the next generation develop into young men and women past sport. And I find like a lot of pride like in that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first off, really appreciate your openness and honesty and everything that you shared that way along your journey there, Nick. And, you know, to your point, like passion is one of those things, it really doesn't make sense if you think about it logically, right? Like, say we take the concept of, well, I'm going to go from a full-time job to an unpaid internship. Doesn't make a
Yeah.
whole lot of sense, but if you want to succeed long term, that is sometimes the step you need to take. You're not the only
Mm.
person that's mentioned that to me, right? Like Derek
Yeah.
Melander,
Yeah.
who we had in the podcast in the past, he's now the strength coach, at least at the current moment, for the Cleveland Cavaliers. But he had to step back from unpaid jobs with benefits and take unpaid internships to get there. And in
Mm.
a lot of ways, I think that's the steps that you have to take to succeed in the sports world, from a like coaching and performance standpoint, very similar to the steps that a lot of the athletes have probably had to take themselves, right? You mentioned you were an
Yeah, for
athlete
sure.
yourself. I mean, how many times did you spend, you know, 5, 6, 7 hours on a bus traveling from point A to point B, just kind of questioning like, do I really want this right now? Like, think of all the other things that I could be doing instead of literally sitting on the back of a coach bus waiting to get from one point to the other. You know, there's a lot of hours and grind and, you know, just overall work that goes completely unseen and unnoticed for the life of an athlete.
Yeah.
But that's also true in the sports science and sports performance world as well, right? Like, in order to get to the point where you understand a lot of these very advanced metrics or like even force plate data, like I remember the first time I pulled up a force plate report and saw like 7 or 8 different like rows of like pages of data, on the
Mm.
printout sheet. And I was just like, where do I even begin with this? Like, in order to get to the point where you understand all that stuff and know exactly what you're looking for, you have to put a lot of time and effort and energy into it. And as you mentioned, you know, the time that we have is very valuable and precious, and it's not something that we can just waste and squander, right? Like, I think about some of these different athletes I've seen at the professional level who, you know, some of them don't really make it because they put their time into things that didn't really matter as much or didn't really move the
Hmm.
needle forward as much, right? Like, there's a
Yeah.
certain football player that comes to mind that didn't really, like, he openly admits he was more focused on the off-field partying and living life kind of thing, instead of like the on-field stuff. And it's very easy for us to squander opportunities that present themselves because our head and our focus is in the wrong area.
And also, I think that's important to even think about, even from a programming standpoint. It's like here at the University of like Maryland, we have a ton of sports science avenues and opportunities and things and technologies we can use to, obviously in hopes to gather data to make sure that we're doing everything possible for the athlete to make sure they're as successful as possible. But it is also very easy to get like too wrapped up into all of the numbers and things like that and almost miss the fact that we still need to, you know, train to get to where we kind of need to go. Like it's like you have, I mean, I might have athletes who have never, you know, performed a goblet squat before, and they're coming in, you know, at the D1 level, and they haven't even really been integrated into, you know, even something that is foundational. So it's like, it's important to understand that while we have all the GPS, while we have the force plates, while we have velocity based training, which I use with teams depending on, you know, their level of training and the outcome and stimulus, like I'm personally looking for them. It's also important to understand that, you know, there's also steps that need to be taken from a foundational standpoint to make sure you're also putting them in the best position possible to be successful. And that's even in the weight room, just from building confidence with some of your athletes, because they might not even want to be in there in the first place. They're not here to become an Olympic weightlifter or step, you know, foot on a platform. So it's important to understand that, you know, your job is to make them the best athlete that they can possibly be and not get too wrapped up in all of, you know, the fancy technologies and stuff like that. And while it's like important to like have that stuff like in your back pocket, it's also important to understand that, you know, you're not just putting a program together that looks cool on social media with all the bells and whistles, and you're reporting all this data and trying to make yourself, you know, appear to be smarter than you probably actually are. It's also important to take a step back and to, you know, really make sure that what you are giving to your athletes and the stuff you are putting together in these programs and things like that is to ultimately think about their development long term, which a lot of the time isn't even getting too wrapped up in that data and stuff early on, because you might have an athlete who has barely even done a hands-on hips jump before, and when you see him do it for the first time, it's like, okay, well, what am I now going to do with this data? This is the first time they've really even ever jumped. Right. So it's like, you're like now seeing your athletes perform all this stuff, and it's like, okay, why am I now going to waste like hours and hours and hours and hours testing and looking at all this data when, you know, they can't even perform the proper skill that you need within those certain types of tests? And then you're like, now looking at this data, and it's like, oh, well, now they're deficient from, you know, one side to the other and all this stuff. And then it's really like, okay, well, you know, that's the first time that athletes ever actually even jumped on one leg versus the other. So it's like, you know, are they really that deficient, or do you actually need to teach them how to execute all of these different types of movements before you're getting all caught up and wrapped up in this data? Because again, like, we live in a world where, you know, we have so much information at our fingertips with our phones and things like that. And I think it's so easy to get wrapped up in everything, but it's important to also understand that your goal is to, you know, develop these young athletes, and it's important not to get wrapped up in all the bells and whistles, I think, because at the end of the day, they still also need to, you know, learn how to safely train and things like this before you're putting them under or through all these different types of modalities and technologies.
I love that point, and I completely agree. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to keep the main thing the main thing. And in the world of sports, the main thing is often the sport, not being the best at exercising. You know, I would love if everyone I ever saw for, you know, ACL rehab, if we get them all doing like, you know, different clean variations, you know, Olympic lifting, even some like heavy strongman stuff. Like, I would love if everyone I ever rehab for an ACL could yoke carry 600 or 700 pounds. It'd just be really cool. But that's not really going to serve them the best, and that doesn't always provide for what they specifically need. So to your point, we have to kind of focus on, I like to think of it as like an analogy of glass and sand in a jar, right? Like, if we have a glass jar and we need to fill the jar, we have to put the big rocks in first, and then we can pour the sand in, the little things, and it's going to kind of fill in all around it. But if we put sand in first and then we try and drop big rocks inside of it, it's not all going to fit. We're going to run out of room because we prioritize the wrong things first. So ultimately, from a training standpoint, I really like to emphasize, to your point, the basic fundamental foundational things. And, I know that there's people out there who might argue that point, like, oh, well, they don't really need to know how to jump or know how to do a proper squat. Like, oh, they're just going to compensate through it. It'll be fine. But it's like, if we're inviting compensation to occur in movement, what are we setting them up for long term, right? Like,
Yeah, for
to your
sure.
point, it's not just the short term. You mentioned it in relation to financials. I think it's not just a short term financial, it's the long term bigger picture thing. The same is true with athletics. I don't just want the athletes that I work with to be in great physical performance and shape when I work with them. Like, I want them to have the skills that they need to sustain them for the rest of their life as well. Because, yeah, sports might eventually end, but that doesn't mean that someone's health and fitness ends as soon as they hang up their cleats, right? Like, and there's a lot of lessons that I feel athletes can take and learn from the weight room in particular and apply to the broader picture of life. And if we don't teach them those things, then ultimately, again, we're doing them a disservice, because we could have provided more for them and we just chose not to because of whatever reason. Maybe it was ego, maybe it was whatever we saw on, Instagram exercise that day, whatever it is. I truly believe that, the better you provide for the long-term picture of the person and keep that long-term end goal in mind, the better they're going to be in the moment with you.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that.
And I think a lot of the athletes, they can tell when you have their best interest in mind. And I think that that's an area too where we were talking about your Instagram earlier. I think that's an area where you really shine is, people can look at you and tell right away, like, you're doing all the fitness things that you promote yourself. I mean, it's not just what the athletes are doing, it's you're doing it as well. You actually, think the phrase is like walk the walk. How does that ability to kind of do what you do, how have you applied what you've learned from your own kind of exercise and fitness, I'll say, into the world that you work with from the athletes?
Yeah, for sure. So like in response to like myself walking the walk like on a daily basis, like something I preach all the time to my athletes is bettering oneself every single day. Like I'm somebody who believes a lot in self-discipline, and I believe this is one of the most important things that somebody can, you know, possess, and that's something that I prioritize in my life every single day. Like I do some sort of training every single day, whether that's physical, whether that's mental, whether that's spiritual. Exercise for me is a way to, you know, escape a little bit from kind of the world that we do live in. And it gives me like some space for like some peace of mind, is like how I would put it. My training and exercise is always something that is ever evolving and changing dependent on my goals and my environment. I'm always trying to find a better way to do something and treat my own training as a way, like constantly as like to pursue like a new experiment in a way, like if that makes sense. Um, just because like I do, I'm coming in every single day and I'm always trying to find a better way to do it. I might have a plan. I have everything laid out up until the end of probably next season with, what I hope my approach does look like, but that is something that is ever changing and ever evolving. And if I do put something on a piece of paper, you know, I am also aware that things do change, sport does change, injuries may occur, somebody might come in slightly fatigued. If an athlete runs 6 miles in a game and has over 250 yards of high speed distance and has 80, accelerations and 60 decelerations in an overtime game, I now can't have that athlete like come into the weight room and potentially perform the percentages that might be on their sheet just because it's like, oh, like I wrote, this program out on this piece of paper. This is what we're going to do. You have to also be able to constantly adapt and evolve like within that. So I do understand, like, there's nothing that I'm writing in a program that is ever random. Like if I add an exercise, I know why I put it there. I know what it does to the body. I know what the athlete should feel when they do perform that exercise. I understand how they'll feel the next day. how can they put themselves in a better position potentially next time, because there's a learning curve to everything that you do, and how that is going to help them be more successful within their sport. And because at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do. So, I think it's extremely important that, when I'm training or what I'm giving my athletes, like nothing I do is ever random. There's a reason and a why behind everything that we're going to do. And that's, I think it goes back to walking the walk and practicing what you preach, because I know what exercises will work great for some athletes. I know what exercises will probably work terrible for some athletes, and I'm not married to anything. So like, for example, in my training, I personally love Olympic weightlifting. I think it's, those types of exercises when done at a high level can, are great for, things like triple extension, things like force production, things like force absorption and deceleration, and understanding what my body has to do under load and absorbing load, and coordination within those movements, because it takes a lot of coordination, and what it does from a neurological standpoint. But I also understand that I'm not just using that exercise because the exercise, is so great. If I have 30 athletes in the weight room and 5 people can clean efficiently, then what happens to the other 25 athletes? I, understand that you have to take a step back sometimes to take a step forward. And it's a lot of the time I don't even use Olympic lifts, even though I think they're some of the best things that you can possibly do from an athletic development standpoint. I don't do them a ton because your time is also understanding that your time is limited with these athletes. It's like, again, like to my point before, where it's like you might have an athlete might have never even goblet squatted before. So I'm trying to teach them how to even squat properly under external load, and how their body needs to control that movement. And now you're doing that with 10 other basic exercises. And now on top of that, you're then going to potentially try and teach them how to clean. And you might only have them in the weight room for 30 to 45 minutes, 2 times a week. Now you're learning like this crazy technical exercise, and you're so married to the exercise that you're not willing to put the athlete in a better and more successful position, which is also probably hurting their confidence, because you might have a 17-year-old girl who doesn't even want to be in the weight room. She's here to play lacrosse at the University of Maryland, the school she's always dreamed of being at. And now I'm potentially going to ruin that dream by, being married to a certain exercise, or what I'm putting on, a workout card, and also realizing, what's working good for some athletes, not working, great for some others, like kind of like I touched on before. So it's, it's also you getting into the weight room and understanding I'm not watching an entire team go through a workout and then realizing, oh, that was probably stupid and I probably shouldn't have done that. Like I already know, everything I need to know about the workout, how long it takes, what everybody needs to feel within these certain exercises. I can walk them through exactly, how they should feel in certain points of the lift even. And it's all about building trust, building buy-in, explaining the why behind everything that they do. So they are now going in turn to do it at a higher level, pay a little bit more attention when you're now explaining this stuff, understanding that what they're doing, like on this piece of paper or on whatever iPad you're using, is ultimately to, put them in the best position possible to be successful on and off the field. And I think it's kind of a bad look for yourself when you're not taking this stuff into account, because at the end of the day, you're trying to put the athlete in the best position possible to be the most successful version of themselves. And I think that when you start, doing all of this stuff, or, you're married to certain exercises, you kind of pigeonhole yourself in a corner a little bit. And ultimately, I think then it makes it harder for you to get what you need to get through to the athlete across, when, in reality, you should be more focused on, building relationships, building trust, building buy-in. And through all of this, then you can focus on, more advanced programming potentially. It's not like you reading some book or some article or watching some video on Instagram and it's like you think you're the smartest person in the room and now we're going to do all these exercises and you have somebody who is like, why am I even doing all this? Like, I don't want to do this. And then it doesn't even matter how great your program is because it's not being done to the level that it needs to be done for one, them to get whatever they need to get out of it. And two, like you're probably just end up, completely wasting your time because you haven't even done all of the things that you needed to do to get the best out of the athlete or to create an environment where they are, fully understanding of why you're doing what you're doing and how it's going to benefit them, because all of this at the end of the day is for them. It shouldn't be about you at all.
Yeah, I completely agree. I love those points you just brought up, Nick. I mean, ultimately, it is about the people we serve, right? Like we're in a service-based field, period. It stops there. And on top of that as well, to your point, we almost have to like humanize strength and conditioning to a certain extent, right? Like a lot of times we get so wrapped up in the perfect program or the perfect percentages and all these little details that just don't matter all that much when, to your point, an athlete might not even be able to do the basic skills required for it, right? Like if my athlete can't even do a hinge type movement like a basic RDL properly, then loading them super heavy with an explosive clean variation probably is not the best thing for them. So I completely echo the points that you just brought up there as in relation to humanizing strength and conditioning, and also just being willing to adjust on the fly and being a little bit flexible in how we coach our athletes, because as you mentioned, things change on the day to day. You mentioned about the practice context and that sort of thing, but let's take a slightly different context here. Let's say one of those athletes had something happen at home, right? You mentioned yourself that you were in that situation. I'd imagine you kind of have to adjust when all of a sudden, like, hey, this athlete's telling me that they're concerned about like their parents supporting their financial side for college and they're struggling to pay rent, or hey, something just happened to someone's family member. Like there's a lot of other little things that pop up in life that we have to account for and adjust in our programs, right? Like, we the art of coaching, I'll say, is not necessarily just like making the perfect program. It's adjusting the program on the fly based how someone presents to you in that moment to make it match what they need then and there. That's what makes it perfect, is not the overall design, but the overall implementation of it to what the athlete needs the most based on how they present when they come to you. And, you mentioned the point too about the why behind it all as well. And, you're someone who actively does a lot of the exercises and movements yourself day in and day out. So that gives you a leg up at coaching them and understanding what you're supposed to feel there, and even common faults, right? Like, I blew my back out last year when I was deadlifting, and now I have a new appreciation for the deadlift because it, took me out for about a month. So going through those things and almost looking at ourselves as a way to like self-experiment and get some of those mistakes out, because I don't mind if I hurt myself when I'm training, but if I injure one of my athletes when they're training, then I've done them a huge disservice. I missed something, and I'll be honest, I probably won't be sleeping that night because it's just gonna, I'm gonna be laying awake and it's gonna haunt me, right? So I need to kind of use myself as a way to experiment and get some of those learning curves on the application side out of the way before those athletes even come in to see me. And I think that kind of leads to a whole new level of care and implementation of what you can do from a coaching standpoint when you have that kind of lens in mind.
Yeah, for sure. Again, like it's like the whole entire point of, even my job goes so far and beyond just exercises, even in the weight room. But at the end of the day, like, the last thing that should ever happen, like an athlete should never get hurt at, a team lift or some stupid warm up that, you thought that looked cool. Like everything that that you are or should be doing, should put them in the safest position possible so they can excel in their sport. And I think like if you're risking that in the weight room because, you believe that they should be doing something that they really shouldn't, I think that's where you really put yourself like in a bad position in so many different levels, from even like buy-in and things like that. And then you're now battling with, trust issues with, your coaching staff. And it's like, well, why were you doing that in the weight room? That doesn't make any sense. So it's like all about, building and creating environment to where you're allowing these athletes to, again, like I've said it a couple of times, but become the best version of themselves. Like I'm never going to put an athlete in a bad position or a position in the weight room that they are not comfortable in. I understand that, some exercises may be better than others, but if, they can't execute that movement in a safe manner, I'm not now doing that movement just because I spent over 100 hours putting exercises and rep schemes and things like that on a piece of paper. Like I'm going to change the exercise to now best suit the athlete so they can best perform the skill, so they can now get the outcome I need for them to be healthier and competing at a higher level. So I think it's really important to like, again, like swallowing your pride a little bit to make sure that you are doing what is best for them in that exact moment.
Right. It's all about what they need right now, right? It's not about what they need, 10 minutes ago or what they're going to need in an hour. It's, hey, this is how they're presenting right now. This is what I need to do right now to help the person in front of us. And this is going to carry over in the long term. And I've noticed you've said that term now quite a few times. And I think I've noticed that you use the phrase made for now quite often. Is that kind of where that made for now kind of analogy comes in, is focused on the things at the present moment specifically?
Yeah, that's basically like what it's all centered around. And that's something that, myself and Missy, who's the head coach here at the University of Maryland for women's field hockey, it's like you come, to a school to come to Maryland to play for Maryland due to, the history of the program and the conference championships and the national championships. And, we just unveiled our new facility in December, and it's, incredible and amazing. And we have like, now some of the best facilities in the entire country for, women's lacrosse and field hockey, and all that is really great. But, nothing, and I say this quote, and this is something that is like, I have this written on a whiteboard at my house, but it says, nothing that you've done up until this point matters anymore. And I think that's extremely important, because if all you're doing is focusing, on the past and, what's happened here and the success that we've had, and, you start feeling like, you deserve certain things. And it's like, oh, just because you're coming here, you're going to win. And it's like, none of that, like nothing that you've done, like, yes, obviously, like you're wanting to build, the right habits and training and stuff you've done, obviously is important up to a certain extent to where we can now compete at the highest level possible. But in reality, like everything is about learning what is like your approach and things like that of what you've done in the past, understanding the history, understanding like it's a huge deal to be here at the University of Maryland and compete within these two sports. But also understanding that none of that now dictates or has any influence on your success moving forward. And it's important to come in every single day, show up every single day, and, give 100% of your effort that you have or might have, and continue, to push forward and to take that mindset in your approach. And that's like everything from the warm up. That's everything from how I approach, the game. That's how I approach myself in the weight room, in the classroom, nutritionally. That might be like how I brush my teeth in the morning. But it's like, it's understanding that, the only thing that matters is, yes, what might have happened in the past, but taking that, learning from that. And it's like, really being 10 or 10 toes down in the present, and understanding that the only thing that matters is what I do from this point moving forward. And ultimately, that's going to determine the success that we have, as a program or us individually. And ultimately, being made for now is, really taking all of that information and being as locked in as possible, like in the present, and now attempting to build the proper habits I now need to do moving forward, ultimately to, do what we want to do, which is, compete for conference and national championships. And that stuff isn't done from anything that we've done in the past or the history that these two programs do possess. Everything that we do from this point moving forward ultimately is either going to get us to that goal or not. And I think it's important just to like be as present as possible, for those things, but ultimately like more for yourself and like your development ultimately, like as a person even.
Yeah, I love that point, and I love the concept of being made for now. Jocko Willink has a line about how he just tries to simplify things into yes or no, binary code, ones or zeros. And if you can simplify things to that level, like, am I going to do this today? Yes or no? Like, am I going to train today? Yes, I'm going to train. Am I going to show up to practice? Yes, I'm going to show up to practice. When I'm at practice, am I going to put my phone away? Yes, I will. Like, when you simplify it down to that level, you can really create an environment that allows people to lock in the present moment and pick up on a lot of different things that they might not have otherwise. And that's not just for athletics, that's for people such as myself in the PT world, strength coaches, whatever that way, right? Like we have a tendency, or at least I do, to sometimes look at my phone, look at the laptop, because we've got to like chart and document and do all these different things. But anytime I'm not spending watching the person in front of me is an opportunity I'm missing to learn from them. And I'm accepting that whatever other thing I'm doing is more important than that, which, maybe sometimes, maybe it's their surgeon texting me and I need to respond to them right away. Maybe in that time, yeah, it's okay. But other times it's like we almost have to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror and be honest with ourselves of if we're always present in the moment and we're taking the most making the most out of every moment that we're given, because if we're not, then we're leaving something on the table. And, we don't know if that's enough until we get thrown into a test, whether that's, a game against a big rival or something like that, or like, from a strength coach, PT standpoint, working with maybe an injured athlete, an injury we haven't seen before, working with a new type of sport, whatever it is that way. Like we never know if we've prepared enough until the given moment. So let's actually lock in and focus on preparing for that moment instead of just kind of assuming we've always done enough.
Yeah, for sure.
Nick, I feel like we've covered a lot of different ground today as it relates to training and meaning more, taking training and applying it to more than just what we think of in the weight room and what it really means to be locked in the moment and being made for success in the right now. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or anything that we might have missed today?
I think one thing that is important, to understand even from, whether it's a strength and conditioning role or athletic training or, sports med, I think the most important thing to understand, like within this field, is it is a people first industry and it's not about you. It's about the athlete that you are dealing with. I think people miss that a lot. I think, again, it's not about likes on social media or giving yourself a pat on the back. It's about creating environment for the young women and men that you are working with. And that's creating and establishing an environment and a culture to, make them the most successful version of themselves on and off the field. I believe that is by far the most important thing. And that's way more important than, you getting wrapped up in, your experience and, all the certifications you might have or all the hours that you've put in to study all this material. Like if you miss that point, I think you do a disservice to like the individuals you are working with. And at the end of the day, you're not even going to be able to get what you need to get done if you do take that approach, because now I can't even build the buy-in and trust like I've talked about before, or the respect from these athletes that I do need to, establish what I personally need to be established to make sure I'm getting everything possible out of them. So now we together can reach the goals we might have for ourselves individually or as a team. You know, I think that's by far the most important thing. And I see sometimes I feel like people get in their own way and they get so wrapped up about, you know, what I'm putting on the piece of paper and doing this and doing that. And it's like, you know, now I'm not taking fatigue into account because it's like, oh, well, you know, I spent all these hours working on this program and this is exactly what we're going to do. And it's like, okay, well, now I haven't taken into account anything that they have done. And now they're smashed and they can't even compete at a high level for the next game they might have because I got so wrapped up in, you know, me and myself and my program, and I lost sight of, you know, what I'm actually here for. And that's, you know, to make sure that I'm putting the athletes in the best position possible to be successful on and off the field. And that is sometimes swallowing your pride and taking a step back and really looking at everything from a holistic viewpoint, because it's way more than about, you know, reps and sets on a piece of paper and all of that other stuff. Like there's so many other things that go into team sport, collegiate athletics, and even outside of that. But I think it's, you know, so important to realize like it genuinely isn't about you at all. It's about them. And if that isn't your goal and you're not prioritizing that, then I think you're, you know, you're not only hurting yourself, but you're hurting them. And your job is to, you know, create and establish an environment and a culture and things like that that are going to make them as successful as possible. And at the end of the day, like you are involved in that, but you are not the most important thing within the program. If anything, I would hate to say like you're the least important, because obviously you are important, but at the end of the day, like it's just not about you. It's about the athletes you serve. It's about the coaches you serve. It's about the people you serve. And, you know, that at the end of the day, to me, is something like I take a lot of pride in and something that I just find extremely important. So if I had like any advice for people, I would say that you really need to, at times, take a step back and to check yourself and to make sure that you're doing everything you possibly can for these young men and women. And at the end of the day, that should be your goal every single day, is to put them in the most successful position possible to now play their sport at the highest level possible and the safest level possible, but also give them opportunities and things and tools they can now take past sport to now, you know, better their lives outside of this whole entire thing. Because at the end of the day, like, yeah, this stuff is important to a certain extent, but you're also, again, having the opportunity to develop, grow, and be a mentor to these young men and women. And I think that it should be your goal every single day to, you know, impact them in a positive manner.
Nick, for people who want to find out more about you or keep up to date with you online on social media, that way, where can they find you at?
Yeah, on Instagram and Twitter, like I'm on both. Like I'm really not on Twitter, but I kind of am sometimes. Like I kind of use it. If you wanted to reach out to me on it and follow along, like that's awesome. Same thing on Instagram. But if you look up at Greyno Strength, you can find me on both. I'm sure you can find my email on our University of Maryland website if you guys have any questions or, you know, want to learn more about potentially our approach to training and things like that, or have any sort of questions. I'm always open ears and try and make sure that, you know, I can be a source for people and help people as much as I can. So if anybody ever has any questions or wants to hit me up on any of those platforms or something, you know, I'll definitely be sure to reach back out and help anyone any way I can.
For sure. We'll be sure to link to all that in the description below as well. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just keep up to date with everything Nick is doing there. Nick, I really appreciate your time today, man. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate it.